It was the afternoon of April 29, 1945, and the train had been sitting on the tracks outside Dachau for 4 days. 40 rail cars, sealed. When the first American soldiers from the 45th Infantry Division climbed up and pried open the doors, they found what no training exercise, no intelligence briefing, and no active imagination had prepared them for. Inside were approximately 2,310 corpses, stacked in positions suggesting the people had died standing up, too cramped in death to fall. The bodies were skeletal, their faces sunken against skulls that pressed through skin like knuckles through wet paper. The smell hit soldiers from 50 yards away. Men who had fought across North Africa, Sicily, and southern France. Men who had seen Anzio, who had waded through the wreckage of Salerno, stood at those doors and wept. Some vomited. Some stood in silence so complete that witnesses described hearing nothing except flies. Then something changed. The grief became something else. Something that had no official name in any army field manual, no category in any military law, no precedent in the training these men had received. What happened next in the hours that followed the liberation of Dachau on April 29, 1945, was witnessed by hundreds of American soldiers, documented in classified after-action reports. Suppressed for decades, investigated by the Army Inspector General, and ultimately understood by military historians as one of the most morally complex episodes of the entire Second World War. The question of what the American soldiers did to the guards they found at Dachau has never been fully resolved in public memory. The answer begins, not at the gates of the camp, but months earlier, in the intelligence assessments that had reached American commanders as they pushed through southern Germany. By April of 1945, Allied forces knew that a network of concentration camps existed across German-controlled territory. The liberation of camps in the east, Majdanek in July 1944, Auschwitz in January 1945, had already sent reports back through military channels describing conditions that most officers refused to believe in their full dimensions. The 45th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Thunderbirds, had been fighting continuously since the Sicily landings in July 1943. Its men had earned a reputation for ferocity that German commanders specifically noted in their situation reports. The division had suffered more than 30,000 casualties over nearly 2 years of uninterrupted combat, a figure that meant the average soldier in the ranks in April 1945 was fighting alongside men he had known for weeks, not years, because the men he had trained with were mostly dead or evacuated. They were combat veterans in the most precise sense of the term. They had learned to process what they saw and continue functioning. They believed, with the certainty of experience, that nothing they would find in Germany could exceed what they had already seen. They were wrong. The town of Dachau sat approximately 10 miles northwest of Munich in Upper Bavaria. The camp had been established on March 22, 1933, making it the first concentration camp in Nazi Germany, operational before the regime's grip had fully consolidated, before the machinery of the Holocaust had been engineered into its final industrial form. For 12 years it had operated. 12 years during which the SS command structure that administered it had developed what can only be described as a professional culture of atrocity, a bureaucracy of suffering with its own promotions, its own institutional knowledge, its own internal logic. When American soldiers arrived on April 29th, approximately 32,000 prisoners were still alive inside the main camp complex. The population had been far higher weeks earlier. As Allied armies closed from the west and Soviet forces advanced from the east, the SS had conducted what became known as death marches, forcing prisoners who could still walk out of camps ahead of the advancing liberators, moving them deeper into Germany, or simply marching them until they died. The bodies on those march routes were among the first indicators that reached American soldiers of what lay ahead. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 157th Infantry Regiment, 45th Division. He was 30 years old, a pre-war soldier who had been commissioned from the Arizona National Guard. He had commanded men in combat for 2 years. His after-action reports from Sicily and Italy were characterized by the military historians who later studied them as models of professional precision, unemotional, accurate, focused exclusively on tactical outcome. On the morning of April 29th, Sparks received orders to advance toward Dachau as part of the broader assault on Munich. His mission was described in operational terms: to clear the area, secure the facilities, and accept the surrender of any German forces present. The orders contained no specific intelligence about what his men would find. What they found, within the first minutes of entering the camp complex, collapsed every framework his training had given him for processing combat. The discovery of the death train came first. Soldiers moving along the rail spur that serviced the camp encountered the 40 cars before they reached the main gate. The first men to open those doors were junior enlisted soldiers, privates and corporals, most of them between 18 and 22 years old. Within minutes, word had spread back through the column. By the time Sparks himself arrived at the scene, soldiers were standing in silence along the tracks. Some were photographing the interior of the cars. Some were unable to look and had turned away. The documentation that emerged from these photographs later became some of the most widely reproduced evidence of Nazi atrocities. What the photographs could not capture was what the soldiers who stood there describe in their own accounts as a kind of epistemic rupture, the sensation of confronting something that the mind recognizes as real but refuses to fully process because the implications are too vast. Inside the main camp, the living were almost as devastating as the dead. Approximately 32,000 prisoners, as the official army count later recorded, were present when American forces entered. Many were so severely malnourished that soldiers described them as appearing barely human, not as an expression of prejudice, but as a precise clinical observation, because the human body at the extremity of starvation ceases to display the proportions and textures that the eye associates with life. Men with the body weight of children reached through the barbed wire. Some could not reach. Some fell against it. American soldiers began immediately distributing whatever food they were carrying, rations, candy, anything, and had to be stopped by medical officers who understood that starved bodies given rich food too suddenly could suffer fatal complications. The knowledge that they could kill people by feeding them was, multiple veterans later described, among the most disorienting experiences of the entire day. The German guards at Dachau presented a complicated picture. Some had fled before the Americans arrived. The SS command had begun evacuating key personnel in the days preceding liberation, with senior officers departing first and leaving behind a garrison composed largely of Waffen-SS soldiers and, in the final hours, Wehrmacht troops who had been sent to assist in what was officially described as maintaining order. When American forces entered the main compound, they encountered approximately 500 German military personnel in various states of readiness. Some had formally surrendered before the Americans arrived, arranging themselves under white flags in designated areas according to the protocols of military capitulation. Some attempted to fight. Some attempted to surrender. The distinction between these groups would become legally and morally significant in the investigations that followed. What happened at the coal yard wall has been documented through testimony from dozens of American soldiers, German prisoners, and civilian witnesses. A group of approximately 300 to 500 SS and Wehrmacht prisoners were moved into an area of the camp near a long wall. The precise sequence of events, who gave orders, whether any orders were given at all, how many guards died, who fired the first shot, and who gave the commands to open fire, has never been established with complete certainty. What the investigations determined, and what is supported by physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and photographic documentation, is that between approximately 3 dozen and as many as several hundred German prisoners were killed by American soldiers in that area over the course of the afternoon. The Army Inspector General's investigation, convened within weeks of the liberation, could not establish an exact figure. Estimates in the historical literature range from 17 killed, the low figure in official Army investigations, to more than 500, figures cited in some German accounts. The most careful scholarly analyses, drawing on the full range of available documentation, generally cite figures in the range of 30 to 50 confirmed deaths attributable to direct unlawful killing, with larger numbers impossible to precisely establish. Lieutenant Sparks, who was present during part of what occurred, described his own actions in accounts given decades later. He stated that he personally fired his pistol into the air and shouted at soldiers to stop firing. He stated that he physically intervened to halt killings. He described in terms that suggested a commanding officer simultaneously processing the shock of what he had seen that morning and the reality that men under his command were committing acts that violated the laws of war he had spent years operating within. His own account is credible because it is corroborated by other witnesses, and because it does not attempt to minimize his own psychological state or the difficulty of what was happening around him. He did not claim that everything was under control. He claimed that he tried to restore control and that it was possible only partly and with difficulty. The soldiers who participated, observed, or failed to intervene have given accounts over the subsequent 80 years that cluster around consistent themes: the sight of the death train, the smell of the camp, the faces of the prisoners, and a feeling described in different terms by different men but consistently pointing toward the same underlying experience: the complete collapse of the psychological distance that combat training creates between a soldier and his actions. American military training in 1944 and 1945 was among the most intensive and systematic ever conducted. It included explicit instruction in the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, and the handling of prisoners of war. The men at Dachau were not ignorant of those rules. They had been trained to process violence within a framework that distinguished between lawful combat and unlawful killing. What the camp destroyed, at least temporarily, was the framework itself. The rules existed to govern something that Dachau revealed had already been operating outside all rules for 12 years. The soldiers who responded with violence were not, by the accounts of those who observed them, acting from hatred of Germany or from racial animus or from any ideological motive. They were acting from something more elemental, a kind of moral vertigo in which the ordinary categories had ceased to function. Sparks was formally investigated by the Inspector General. General George Patton, whose Third Army oversaw the liberation, conducted a personal inquiry. The investigation concluded that violations of the laws of war had occurred. It also concluded, in a judgment that has remained controversial among military historians ever since, that charges would not be preferred. General Patton's written assessment, preserved in Army records and later declassified, characterized the events as understandable, given the conditions, and declined to recommend court-martial proceedings. The decision reflected a calculation that defies simple characterization, that holding individual soldiers criminally accountable for actions taken hours after discovering the death train and the camp required a standard of moral judgment that could not reasonably be applied to men in their condition at that moment in that place. Whether that judgment was correct is a question that military lawyers, ethicists, and historians have been debating for 8 decades without resolution. The legal questions were complicated by practical ones. Eyewitness identification of specific soldiers involved in specific killings was difficult in a scene involving hundreds of men spread across multiple locations. The chaos of the liberation. Prisoners streaming through areas where guards had been shot. Soldiers moving in multiple directions simultaneously. The absence of any organized command structure for the first hours made it impossible to reconstruct events with the precision required for criminal prosecution. Some of the most credible witnesses to specific acts were themselves German prisoners whose accounts could be challenged on grounds of bias. American soldiers who might have testified against their comrades largely declined to do so. The Army's investigation produced a finding that violations had occurred, but no charges. It was a legal outcome that satisfied almost no one at the time and satisfies fewer now. What is less often examined than the killings at the wall is the behavior of the majority of American soldiers at Dachau during the liberation and the days that followed. The 45th Division established medical facilities inside the camp within hours of arrival. Soldiers who had been combat infantry transformed, often within the same afternoon, into something approximating medical orderlies, carrying prisoners who could not walk, distributing water under medical supervision, clearing the barracks of the dead. Engineers were brought forward to restore sanitation. The Army's historical record of the liberation includes accounts of soldiers who spent hours at the camp, then returned to their units and resumed combat operations against German forces in the Munich area the following morning. The same men who participated in or witnessed unlawful killings at the Coalyard Wall also provided the immediate humanitarian response that kept thousands of surviving prisoners alive in the critical hours before organized medical relief arrived. The moral complexity of Dachau has never been reduced to a clean narrative. American popular memory of the liberation has tended to emphasize the humanitarian response and minimize or omit entirely the killings, while German accounts, particularly in the immediate post-war years, emphasized the killings as evidence of American wrongdoing in a way that served obvious ideological purposes. Neither emphasis is adequate to the historical record. The killings happened. They were unlawful by the standards of the laws of war that American soldiers had been explicitly trained to uphold. They were also explicable, not justifiable, but explicable, in terms of what those soldiers had spent the preceding hours experiencing. Any serious attempt to understand what happened at Dachau on April 29, 1945 must hold both of those truths simultaneously. The survivors of Dachau, who were interviewed in the decades after liberation, gave accounts that add another dimension entirely to the events of that afternoon. For most prisoners, the arrival of American soldiers was experienced not as a sequence of events that could be parsed for moral meaning, but as a sudden and overwhelming end to an existence that had become entirely organized around survival measured in hours. Many survivors described watching through the barbed wire as German guards were shot and feeling responses they later found difficult to reconcile with their own self-understanding. Relief, something close to satisfaction, emotions they were not certain they were permitted to feel. The testimony of survivors on this question is not uniform. Some expressed distress at the killings, some expressed indifference, some expressed approval. The full range of human response to extreme circumstances was present in those accounts, which is precisely what should be expected from 32,000 individuals who had been through experiences that no single framework can contain. General Patton, who visited Dachau on May 3, 1945, 4 days after the liberation, recorded his impressions in his diary. He had ordered his aide to accompany him with a camera because he wanted documentation that could not later be disputed. What he wrote that evening was, by the standards of his own extensive diary, unusually brief. He described what he saw. He did not editorialize. He described being unable to eat for the remainder of the day. This from a man who had spent 3 years eating field rations within audible range of artillery fire, and who had visited the aftermath of some of the most violent battles of the Western Front, was not a minor notation. It was the closest Patton came, in a document characterized throughout by a studied emotional detachment, to admitting that something had exceeded his capacity to absorb it. The investigation into the Dachau killings was classified for years. When it was eventually declassified and available to researchers, the documents revealed not just the findings of the Inspector General, but the internal deliberations of officers at the highest levels of the Army Command in Europe about how to handle a situation for which no precedent existed and no clear legal or moral framework was adequate. Some of the memoranda in those files are remarkable for their candor. Officers who had spent careers in an institution built around the rule of law were writing to each other about events that the rule of law, as they understood it, did not fully equip them to adjudicate. The decision not to prosecute was not made from ignorance of what had occurred. It was made with full knowledge of what had occurred and with a recognition that the law, in that moment, had reached its limit. Felix Sparks lived until 2007, dying at 92 in Denver, Colorado. He spoke about Dachau relatively rarely in his later years, but did give a series of recorded interviews to the Denver Post and to oral history projects that documented his account in some detail. He was consistent across decades in his description of what he saw, what he did, and what he witnessed. He did not attempt to minimize the killings or to characterize them as heroic. He described them as what they were, a breakdown of military discipline under conditions that had destroyed the psychological context within which discipline operates. He also described with equal consistency the camp itself, the death train, the prisoners. He did not separate those things. They happened in the same hours, caused by the same chain of events, and to understand one required understanding the other. The soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division received no official commendation for the liberation of Dachau. The Army's institutional response to April 29, 1945, was characterized throughout by a desire to document what had been found while managing the complications of how it had been responded to. The men who had walked into those death train cars, who had looked through the barbed wire at 32,000 people, reduced to the threshold of humanity by 12 years of systematic brutality, who had then done things that violated their training and their law, and perhaps their own sense of who they were. Those men returned to combat the following morning. Munich fell to American forces on April 30th. The war in Europe ended 9 days later. On May 8th, the men of the 45th were still in Germany, still in uniform, still under orders. What happened at Dachau on April 29, 1945 cannot be explained by any single cause. It cannot be justified by the magnitude of what the soldiers found, though that magnitude is real and documented and beyond reasonable dispute. It cannot be condemned without confronting the conditions that produced it, not to excuse what occurred, but because condemnation issued in ignorance of context is a form of moral performance rather than moral judgment. The military historians who have studied this most carefully, Robert Abzug, whose 1985 work Inside the Vicious Heart remains the foundational text, John McManus, whose research on the 45th Division draws on the most complete available archive, have all arrived at something that resembles not resolution, but a kind of sustained reckoning. The event demands witness. It resists verdict. The men who were there carried it with them for the rest of their lives in ways that the public record only partly captures. Felix Sparks described it as the worst day of his life. He had been present for some of the worst combat of the Italian campaign. He had commanded men through battles that produced casualty rates that would be difficult to credit if they were not documented. Dachau was worse, not because of what the soldiers did, but because of what they found. And because what they found made the distinction between what soldiers should do and what soldiers did, on that afternoon, in that place, briefly and terribly impossible to maintain. The archives that contain the fullest documentation of what happened at Dachau on April 29, 1945, are held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, the Army Center of Military History in Washington, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The photographs taken by soldiers of the 45th Division that afternoon are among the most widely reproduced images of the liberation. The classified reports that were declassified in the 1990s are available to any researcher who requests them. The oral histories recorded by Felix Sparks and other veterans are preserved in multiple archives. The full record is there for anyone who wants to understand not just what happened, but what it means that it happened. What it means that men trained to uphold the laws of war found themselves unable to do so, not from cruelty, not from ideology, not from indifference, but from an encounter with a human evil so systematic and so vast that it temporarily overwhelmed every structure the modern world had built to contain the worst of what people do to each other. That is what the American soldiers found at Dachau. That is what some of them did. And that is why, 80 years later, the question of what happened on that afternoon in southern Bavaria has never produced a comfortable answer, because the event itself was not comfortable, and history that makes it so is not history at all.